The United States presidents. We've had 47 of these guys. Well, 45, but due to 2 of them having 2 inconsecutive terms, the count is 47. Some were good, some were bad, some were weird. But no matter where your opinion lies in terms of politics or how they did when sitting in the big chair, it's undeniable that these guys are pretty freaking interesting. I mean, seriously, the fact alone that each of these guys was like, okay, yeah, I can probably run the country, is pretty interesting in itself. Look at America. I wouldn't want to lead it. A melting pot, you say? More like a tossed salad with lots of spice, and guns, and perhaps some croutons. Anyway, today on Historical History, we will be taking a look at the first 15 presidents and exploring at least one interesting or perhaps lesser-known fact about each. And we'll get to the other 30 guys eventually. This will probably end up being a 3-part series. If you like topics like this, be sure to subscribe, after liking the video, of course. That way you can stay up to date on our weekly documentaries. Let's get this show on the road. Starting at the beginning, we have George Washington. When old Georgie boy became the first president of the United States in 1789, there was no White House, no Washington, D.C., and no permanent capital. Instead, he governed from 2 of America's early hubs, New York City and Philadelphia, and in doing so, he helped define what a president even was. In New York City, the fledgling capital, Washington first moved into the Samuel Osgood House on Cherry Street. Modest and cramped by presidential standards, it quickly proved too small for official receptions and cabinet meetings. So, Washington relocated to the more spacious Alexander Macomb House, a grander home near today's Wall Street, where he began hosting foreign diplomats and shaping the executive office from scratch. But by 1790, the capital moved to Philadelphia, and with it, the presidency. There, Washington lived at the President's House on Market Street, a fine brick mansion leased from wealthy financier Robert Morris. It served as the nation's de facto executive mansion for the next decade. In Philadelphia, Washington held levees, formal receptions, met with Congress, and refined the rituals of presidential leadership. But behind the pomp was a disturbing truth. Washington brought enslaved people with him to the president's house, including Ona Judge, who would famously escape from his household. To avoid Pennsylvania's gradual abolition law, which would automatically free enslaved people after 6 months of residency, Washington rotated his enslaved staff back to Virginia just before the deadline. It was a calculated loophole, one that casts a long shadow over the myth of the man. Still, these early residences, cobbled together in 2 northern cities, became the proving grounds of the presidency. With no White House, no West Wing, and no blueprint to follow, Washington had only his judgment, his presence, and 2 temporary homes from which to lead a brand new nation. So yeah, he wasn't homeless, but no White House. But guess what our second interesting fact about the next president is, huh? I bet you can't. When John Adams, our second president, moved into the White House in November 1800, he was making history. Construction on the Executive Mansion had begun 8 years earlier in 1792, and although it was far from finished, Adams insisted on moving in before his term ended. Show off. The city of Washington, D.C. at the time was barely more than a muddy construction site. Streets were unpaved, the government buildings were isolated islands in a vast, underdeveloped landscape. And the White House itself, then called simply the President's House, was still surrounded by scaffolding. Fireplaces smoked, rooms echoed, and many spaces were unfinished or unfurnished. Adams arrived alone on November 1st, 1800, with his wife, Abigail, joining him a few days later. In a letter to her, he famously wrote, "May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." Boy, do I have some bad news for you on that one, John. That single line, carved into a fireplace mantel in the White House today, marks the symbolic beginning of the White House not just as a residence, but as the center of American executive power. But the house was far from comfortable. Abigail Adams was known to hang her laundry in the East Room, the grandest space in the mansion, because it was one of the few large, dry areas with sufficient airflow. And since Washington was still being built, many social and political functions remained in Philadelphia or were handled informally. Adams would only live in the White House for a few months. He lost the election of 1800 to Thomas Jefferson, who moved in the following March. But Adams's brief residency set a precedent that has continued unbroken for over 2 centuries. When Thomas Jefferson left the presidency in 1809, he didn't retire quietly to Monticello to reflect on his legacy. He began what he considered one of his greatest achievements, founding the University of Virginia. Jefferson didn't just fund the school, he designed it, personally laying out the plans for the academical village, an innovative model of higher education that rejected the rigid, monastic designs of European universities. Instead of a single massive structure, he envisioned a U-shaped arrangement of pavilions, each housing a professor and classrooms, with student dormitories interspersed among them. At the center stood the rotunda, inspired by the Roman Pantheon, a library as the symbolic and literal heart of learning. Jefferson oversaw everything from the architecture to the curriculum, and even the selection of faculty. He believed that education should be secular, public, and free from religious doctrine, a revolutionary idea at the time. When the university opened in 1825, it was among the first in the world to teach subjects like astronomy, modern languages, and political science. Despite his many achievements, author of the Declaration of Independence, president, diplomat, Jefferson was most proud of founding the University of Virginia. In fact, on his tombstone, he listed only 3 accomplishments: author of the Declaration of American Independence, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. He left off being president altogether, and his reluctance to free any of the 600 slaves who languished under him during his lifetime. We have a video on that one if you want to learn more about Tom Long-a-Ding-Dong and his contradictions. Links in the description. Standing at just 5 feet, 4 inches, and weighing barely 100 pounds, James Madison was the shortest and lightest president in U.S. history. But what he lacked in stature, he more than made up for in intellect and political vision. Known as the father of the Constitution, Madison was the principal architect behind the foundational document that still governs the United States today. His notes from the Constitutional Convention of 1787 are the most detailed account we have of the debates that shaped the Republic, because he took it upon himself to record them, meticulously and in secret. Despite his frail appearance and chronic health problems, including seizures that may have been epilepsy, Madison was a political powerhouse. He helped draft the Bill of Rights, co-wrote the Federalist Papers, and later served as Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, before becoming the 4th President of the United States. But Madison's small frame was often the subject of contemporary commentary. British diplomat Anthony Merry once sneered that Madison looked more like a schoolboy than a statesman. Yet it was this schoolboy who would lead the country through the War of 1812, the first major test of the young republic's survival. And in one of history's ironic twists, it was his wife, Dolly Madison, who stole the spotlight during that war. As British troops approached the White House in 1814, she famously stayed behind to save a portrait of George Washington, while Madison commanded the war effort. When James Monroe took office in 1817, America was weary from the War of 1812, politically divided and uncertain of its future. But by the time he left office in 1825, the country had entered a period so tranquil and unified, it gained a nickname, the Era of Good Feelings. I am sure we will approach an era like that someday. I mean, this last one was only over 200 years ago. Anyway, the name wasn't just poetic, it was practically official. During Monroe's presidential tour of New England in 1817, a Federalist newspaper, traditionally opposed to Monroe's Democratic-Republican Party, coined the phrase to describe the unusually warm reception he received, even from political opponents. For the first time in decades, partisanship seemed to be fading. Monroe presided over a time of relative national unity, westward expansion, and economic optimism. Though his presidency wasn't without challenges, including the Panic of 1819 and debates over slavery and sectionalism, Monroe's calm demeanor and non-confrontational style helped smooth over tensions. But perhaps Monroe's most enduring legacy came from a few lines in his 1823 annual message to Congress, which became known as the Monroe Doctrine. In it, he warned European powers that further colonization in the Americas would be seen as a hostile act. While largely symbolic at the time, the doctrine would later become a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. And here's a bonus bit of trivia. Monroe was the last president who was a founding father, and he died on July 4th, 1831, the third president to die on Independence Day, after John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, both of whom died exactly 5 years earlier. John Quincy Adams may have been one of the most intellectually brilliant men ever to occupy the White House. Fluent in multiple languages, a seasoned diplomat by age 14, and the son of a president. But his daily routine was anything but conventional. Every morning, like clockwork, Adams would walk from the White House to the Potomac River, disrobe, and swim naked in its waters. He believed in the health benefits of cold immersion and took these swims as seriously as any official meeting. Plus, swimming is good exercise, right? This peculiar habit became known to the press, and it even resulted in one of the first bold acts of American political journalism. In the 1820s, Anne Royal, a female reporter who had been repeatedly denied an interview with the president, got creative. She reportedly waited by the river one morning until Adams entered the water, gathered up his clothes, and refused to return them until he answered her questions, making her, arguably, the first female journalist to interview a U.S. president. Adams's presidency, 1825 to 1829, was controversial and largely ineffective due to intense political opposition. But his post-presidency career was a stunning comeback. He was elected to the House of Representatives, where he served for 17 years and became a fierce opponent of slavery. His efforts included fighting the infamous gag rule, which barred any discussion of slavery in Congress. John Quincy Adams may not have been the most popular president, but he was one of the most principled and relentless public servants in U.S. history, and one of the only presidents who could say they started their day with a naked swim in the nation's capital. Andrew Jackson was known as Old Hickory, a nickname earned from his toughness as a general, and that toughness followed him straight into the White House. No moment better illustrates that than the day in 1835 when Jackson became the first sitting U.S. president to survive an assassination attempt and responded by beating his attacker with a cane. On January 30th, 1835, Jackson was attending a funeral at the U.S. Capitol when a man named Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter, stepped out from behind a pillar and aimed a pistol at the president from just a few feet away. He pulled the trigger, and the gun misfired. Jackson, then 67 years old, didn't run. Instead, he charged his attacker with his cane. As Jackson swung wildly, Lawrence pulled out a second pistol, and it also misfired. Historians later tested the weapons and concluded the odds of both guns failing were astronomically low. I mean, seriously, it sucks to be that guy. It took several bystanders, including Davy Crockett, to restrain the furious president and subdue the would-be assassin, who was declared insane and spent the rest of his life in an institution. The incident only added to Jackson's legend. Already controversial for his populist politics, his war against the Bank of the United States and the brutal Indian Removal Act, Jackson cultivated a public image of raw, unfiltered strength. He carried bullets in his body from earlier duels and battles, and once killed a man in a duel over an insult to his wife. Whether you admire or condemn him, there's no denying this. Andrew Jackson reshaped the presidency into something more forceful, more personal, and far more combative. Martin Van Buren holds a distinction that's easily overlooked but symbolically powerful. He was the first U.S. president born a citizen of the United States, not as a subject of the British Crown. Wait a minute. The first 7 guys are illegals? Show me their birth certificates. Build a wall. Vaccines cause autism. Run! Born in 1782 in Kinderhook, New York, Van Buren entered the world 6 years after the Declaration of Independence. All of his presidential predecessors, from Washington to Jackson, had been born British subjects before the American Revolution. Van Buren was the first to be born into an independent America. That alone gives him a unique place in presidential history. But there's more. Van Buren was also the first president for whom English was not the first language. He grew up speaking Dutch in a tight-knit Dutch-American community and didn't learn English until he went to school. He remains the only president to have spoken English as a second language. Politically, Van Buren was a master organizer. He helped found what became the Democratic Party, engineered Andrew Jackson's political rise, and was one of the early architects of the modern two-party system. His skills earned him the nickname the Little Magician, partly for his political wizardry and partly because of his 5'6" frame and sharp style. Though his presidency, 1837 to 1841, was rocked by the Panic of 1837, a massive economic depression, his legacy lies more in the machinery of American politics. Party conventions, state committees, and campaign structures that endure to this day. Oh, and one more fun fact. Van Buren's hometown of Kinderhook gave rise to the phrase "OK," which some say originated from his nickname, Old Kinderhook. Supporters used OK on campaign buttons, and the abbreviation stuck. I guess the only thing I can say about that is, okay then. William Henry Harrison holds two of the most extreme records in presidential history. He gave the longest inaugural address and served the shortest term in office. On March 4, 1841, Harrison took the oath of office at age 68, the oldest president to that point. Determined to show he was still vigorous and up to the job, he gave an inaugural address that ran nearly 2 hours and stretched over 8,000 words. He did so without a coat, hat, or gloves, standing in the freezing cold as a snowstorm loomed over Washington, D.C. Just 3 weeks later, Harrison fell ill. The story often told is that his long, unprotected speech in the cold led to pneumonia, though modern historians think it may have actually been typhoid fever from the White House's contaminated water supply. Either way, his condition worsened, and on April 4, 1841, just 31 days into his presidency, William Henry Harrison died. He never signed a single bill into law. He never set policy. His entire presidency was shorter than the time it takes most modern presidents to staff their cabinets. But Harrison's brief tenure had lasting consequences. His death triggered the first constitutional crisis of presidential succession. The Constitution said the vice president would assume the powers and duties of the presidency, but it was unclear if he would become president or simply act as a placeholder. John Tyler, Harrison's vice president, boldly declared himself the new president of the United States, not just acting president. His decision created a precedent that would eventually be codified in the 25th Amendment. All thanks to a man who spoke too long, stood too proud, and died too soon. When William Henry Harrison died just 31 days into office, his vice president, John Tyler, was suddenly thrust into the highest office in the land. The first time in U.S. history a president had died in office. What followed was a constitutional gamble that changed the presidency forever. The Constitution was vague on succession. Did the vice president become the president or simply act as a stand-in? Tyler left no doubt. He immediately took the oath of office, moved into the White House, and demanded to be addressed as President Tyler. Many in Congress grumbled, calling him His Excellency, but Tyler's bold assertion created a precedent that endures to this day. Politically, Tyler was a man without a party. Though elected as a Whig, he quickly clashed with Whig leaders like Henry Clay and vetoed much of their agenda. The Whigs expelled him from the party while he was still in office, making Tyler the first and only president effectively unaffiliated with any party during his term. But Tyler's most astonishing legacy is personal. He fathered 15 children, more than any other U.S. president. He had 8 children with his first wife, Letitia, who died during his presidency, and 7 more with his second wife, Julia Gardner, 30 years his junior. Well, that's kind of gross. And here's the kicker. 2 of John Tyler's grandsons were still alive well into the 21st century. That's not a typo. His son, Lyon Gardner Tyler Sr., had children in his 70s, and those sons lived past 2020. Tyler was born in 1790, and his grandchildren lived into the era of smartphones and space travel. From accidental president to political rebel to patriarch of an improbably long family line, John Tyler is a reminder that sometimes history's footnotes contain the most astonishing stories. James K. Polk isn't a name that dominates history books, but he may be the most efficient and focused president the United States has ever had. Elected in 1844 as something of a dark horse candidate, Polk entered office with a short, specific list of what he wanted to accomplish, and in just 4 years, he did all of it. His 4-point presidential agenda was ambitious: re-establish the independent treasury system, lower tariffs, settle the Oregon boundary dispute with Britain, acquire California and New Mexico from Mexico. Polk achieved all 4. Most remarkably, he oversaw the Mexican-American War, 1846-1848, a conflict that, though controversial, resulted in the U.S. gaining over 500,000 square miles of territory, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Nevada. It was the largest territorial expansion of the United States in a single presidential term. Polk also kept a detailed diary, one of the earliest and most comprehensive presidential records of its kind. His entries offer a rare, candid glimpse into the day-to-day operations of the White House in the 1840s, from policy decisions to cabinet gossip. But perhaps the most unusual thing about Polk was his determination to leave after 1 term. True to his word, he declined to run for re-election in 1848. Exhausted by the weight of office and deteriorating in health, he left Washington and died just 3 months later, making him the shortest-lived former president. James K. Polk expanded the map, kept his promises, and exited the stage on his own terms. In the words of one historian, "No president who accomplished more served for less time." Before entering politics, Zachary Taylor had spent 4 decades as a career military officer, serving in wars, from the War of 1812 to the Mexican-American War. He was known as Old, Rough, and Ready. That's what I used to call my ex-wife. This name was for his unpretentious manner and battlefield grit. Taylor became a national hero after decisive victories in Mexico, and that fame carried him straight into the White House. The irony? He had never voted in a U.S. election, not even his own. Taylor considered himself a soldier first and foremost, and believed it was inappropriate for military officers to engage in politics. He didn't even publicly declare a party affiliation until after being nominated by the Whigs in 1848. His political views were so vague that even his supporters weren't entirely sure where he stood on major issues. But his battlefield popularity carried the day. When it came time for the election, Taylor was still on active military duty and had never registered to vote, nor shown much interest in doing so. Some reports suggest he may have finally cast a vote in 1848, but not for himself, likely out of modesty, principle, or disinterest. Once in office, Taylor proved more independent than the Whigs expected. Though a Southern slaveholder, he opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, a stance that put him at odds with much of his base. His presidency was shaping up to be a tense turning point on the road to civil war, but Taylor would not live to see the outcome. In July 1850, just 16 months into his term, he became violently ill after attending 4th of July festivities. Officially, he died of a stomach ailment, though conspiracy theories of poisoning have long persisted. Zachary Taylor entered the White House as a political mystery and left it unexpectedly. A reluctant president whose military instincts may have helped him fight for national unity, had he lived to act on them. Millard Fillmore may be one of the most obscure presidents in American history, but he holds the distinction of bringing some of the first modern conveniences to the White House, among them the first bathtub and first kitchen stove. Before Fillmore, presidents and their families bathed using basins and pitchers, or in some cases, wooden tubs that had to be manually filled with hot water. Fillmore had a running water system installed in the White House, along with an actual bathtub, a luxury at the time. He also introduced a cooking stove, replacing the inefficient open hearth that had been used since Washington's time. These may seem like minor upgrades, but they marked the beginning of the White House's transformation into a truly modern residence. Despite these creature comforts, Fillmore's presidency, 1850 to 1853, was marked by growing national discomfort. He took office after the sudden death of Zachary Taylor, becoming the second vice president to ascend to the presidency unexpectedly. Politically, Fillmore is remembered for signing the Compromise of 1850, which aimed to ease tensions between North and South over slavery. One of its most controversial provisions was the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens in free states to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. While Fillmore believed he was preserving the Union, the law enraged abolitionists and further polarized the country. Still, Fillmore retained a strong sense of dignity and civility. He refused an honorary degree from Oxford because he said he lacked the literary or scientific attainment to justify it. And while he may not top presidential rankings, his legacy lives on every time someone turns on the hot water. And then, of course, you turn it too far, and before you know it, you burn your hand. That's Fillmore for you. That smug son of a bitch.
Franklin Pierce's presidency is often overshadowed by his deep unpopularity and the nation's slide towards civil war. But there's one strange and little-known episode that stands out. He was arrested while serving as president, allegedly for running over an old woman with his horse. I'm sorry, but that's pretty crazy, right? The incident occurred in 1853, just months into Pierce's term. As the story goes, he was driving his carriage through Washington, D.C. when it struck a pedestrian, described in newspaper reports as an elderly woman. Pierce was arrested, but the case was quickly dropped due to lack of evidence, and the woman apparently disappeared from the record. Some historians believe the charge was politically motivated, while others view it as a reflection of Washington's chaotic urban conditions at the time. But that bizarre moment is just one chapter in a deeply tragic life. Pierce, often considered one of the most handsome presidents, suffered devastating personal loss. Just weeks before his inauguration, he and his wife Jane were traveling by train when it derailed. Their 11-year-old son, Benny, was killed before their eyes, crushed by wreckage. He was their last surviving child. Both Franklin and Jane Pierce entered the White House in mourning. Jane refused to attend most public functions and wore black for much of his term. Pierce himself never seemed to recover. He was haunted by guilt, believing his political ambition had cursed his family. Politically, Pierce tried to appease both North and South, but his support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed slavery to expand into new territories, led to bloody conflict and earned him widespread condemnation in the North. After his presidency, he became one of the few former presidents to openly criticize Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, further damaging his legacy. Franklin Pierce may be remembered as one of the least effective presidents, but his story is one of profound sorrow.
unusual controversy, and one very strange encounter with the law.
Last on our list for today is the 15th president, James Buchanan. Buchanan holds a unique distinction in U.S. history. He is the only president who never married. Throughout his life and presidency, he remained a lifelong bachelor, and his personal life has long been the subject of speculation, scrutiny, and a touch of mystery. In his early years, Buchanan was engaged to a wealthy woman named Anne Coleman. But the engagement ended abruptly in 1819 under unclear circumstances. Shortly after their breakup, Anne died suddenly, possibly from suicide, though the cause was never officially recorded. Buchanan was reportedly devastated and never pursued another formal relationship. Instead, he maintained an unusually close lifelong friendship with William Rufus King, a senator from Alabama and later vice president under Franklin Pierce. The two lived together for many years in Washington and referred to each other as better half and Mrs. King's nickname among contemporaries was even Aunt Fancy. While there's no definitive evidence of a romantic relationship, historians continue to debate the nature of their bond and whether Buchanan may have been America's first LGBTQ+ president, though it remains speculative. During his presidency, 1857 to 1861, Buchanan faced one of the most volatile periods in American history. As Southern states began seceding in the final months of his term, Buchanan did very little. He believed that secession was illegal, but also that the federal government had no authority to stop it, a constitutional paradox that paralyzed his response. By the time he left office, 7 states had seceded, and the Union was teetering on the brink of civil war. Abraham Lincoln inherited a country Buchanan had failed to hold together. Buchanan once described his presidency as a time of trial, but critics then and now have judged him harshly for inaction in the face of crisis. He returned to his estate in Pennsylvania and largely avoided public life, publishing a defensive memoir that convinced few. Whether remembered for his indecisiveness, his solitary personal life, or the questions that linger about both, James Buchanan remains one of the most enigmatic and criticized presidents in American history.
And there you go. Those are some interesting, at least I think they're interesting, facts on the first 15 presidents of the United States. What do you think? Would you like to grab a beer with one of these guys? Are there even more interesting facts we didn't discuss? Sound off in the comments below. Be sure to like, subscribe, share the video with your friends and all that YouTube stuff, as it really helps out. And we will see you next week.